Have you ever wondered what it was like to face death in medieval times? Not the quick, merciful end we might imagine, but something far more terrifying. The Middle Ages were a brutal period where executions weren't just about ending a life. They were about sending a message, breaking spirits, and creating spectacles that would haunt witnesses for decades to come. In this video, I'm going to reveal the most horrifying medieval deaths ever recorded. These aren't just stories from dusty history books. These are real accounts of human suffering so extreme that even hardened executioners would sometimes refuse to continue. We're talking about deaths so savage that they changed the course of history and left entire kingdoms trembling in fear. But here's what makes this even more chilling. Every single death I'm about to share with you was considered completely legal and justified by the standards of the time. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. These were calculated, methodical punishments designed by some of the most twisted minds in human history. I've spent weeks researching medieval execution records, court documents, and witness testimonies to bring you the most accurate and complete picture of these horrifying ends. Some of these stories have never been told in their full, gruesome detail, because they're simply too disturbing for most historians to document completely. Now, before we dive into these accounts, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval justice. These deaths were so brutal that they make modern horror movies look like children's fairy tales. If you have a weak stomach, or you're easily disturbed by graphic descriptions of violence, you might want to click away now. But if you're ready to explore the darkest corners of human history, then let's begin with a death so shocking that it changed the way an entire empire viewed justice forever. The year was 1238, and the Mongol Empire was at the height of its power under the rule of Ogedei Khan. In the conquered city of Kiev, a group of nobles had been plotting rebellion against their Mongol overlords. When their conspiracy was discovered, their punishment would become legendary for its sheer brutality and psychological torture. The ringleader of the rebellion was a man named Dmitry Volkov, a former prince who had refused to bow to Mongol authority. His capture marked the beginning of an execution so elaborate and horrifying that witnesses would speak of it in whispered tones for generations. The Mongols didn't simply execute their prisoners. They understood that true power came from breaking not just the body, but the spirit. Dmitry was brought to the center of Kiev's main square, where a crowd of thousands had been forced to watch. But this wasn't going to be a quick beheading or hanging. The executioners had prepared something far more sinister. They had constructed a series of bronze bulls, each one hollow inside and equipped with a system of pipes and chambers. These weren't just execution devices. They were instruments of psychological warfare designed to maximize suffering and terror. Dmitry was stripped naked and forced into the first bronze bull. The opening was then sealed shut, trapping him inside the metal chamber. But the real horror was yet to come. Beneath the bull, the executioners lit a massive fire, slowly heating the bronze until it began to glow red hot. As the metal heated, Dmitry's screams echoed through the pipes, creating an otherworldly sound that resembled the bellowing of an actual bull. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the bronze grew brighter and hotter, knowing that inside, a human being was being slowly cooked alive. But the Mongols weren't finished. They had learned that Dmitry had a teenage son who had also participated in the rebellion. The boy was brought forward and forced to listen to his father's agonized cries for nearly an hour before the sounds finally stopped. The psychological impact of this execution was immediate and devastating. Word spread throughout the conquered territories about what happened to those who defied Mongol rule. But more importantly, it established a pattern of extreme brutality that would define medieval justice for centuries to come. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across medieval Europe, rulers and executioners were constantly devising new ways to make death as painful and public as possible. The goal wasn't just punishment. It was about creating fear so profound that it would prevent future rebellions and maintain absolute control over the population. In England, during the reign of Edward I, a new form of execution was being perfected that would make the bronze bull look merciful by comparison. It was called drawing and quartering, but the reality was far more complex and horrifying than the simple name suggests. The process began not with death, but with a journey. Condemned prisoners were tied to wooden frames called hurdles and dragged through the streets behind horses. The rough stones and dirt would tear at their backs and limbs, but this was merely the opening act of their torment. Upon reaching the execution site, the real horror began. The prisoner would be partially hanged, but deliberately cut down before death could claim them. This timing required skill and experience from the executioner, who had to judge exactly when to stop the strangulation to keep the victim conscious for what came next. What followed was a systematic dismantling of the human body, while the victim remained fully aware. The executioner would make precise cuts to open the abdomen, carefully removing organs one by one. Each removal was timed to maintain consciousness for as long as possible, ensuring that the condemned experienced every moment of their destruction. The crowd would watch in fascinated horror as hearts were pulled from chests and held up, still beating for all to see. Internal organs were thrown into fires while their former owners watched, creating a spectacle that combined execution with theatrical performance. Execution with theatrical performance. The final act involved the actual quartering, where powerful horses were attached to each limb. But even this wasn't simply about tearing the body apart. The executioners had learned that human joints were remarkably strong, so they would often use knives to weaken the connections between bones and muscles, ensuring that the dismemberment would be successful while the victim remained conscious. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the physical brutality, but the calculated precision. These weren't crimes of passion or moments of uncontrolled rage. Every cut, every timing, every element was carefully planned and rehearsed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. But perhaps no medieval death was more psychologically devastating than the execution method developed in the Holy Roman Empire during the 13th century. It was called the breaking wheel, and it represented the absolute pinnacle of human cruelty disguised as divine justice. The wheel itself was a large wooden structure, typically 8 feet in diameter, with spokes radiating from the center. The condemned would be tied spread eagle across the wheel, their limbs positioned over the gaps between the spokes. This positioning was crucial because it meant that when the executioner brought down his hammer, the bones would have nowhere to go but to shatter completely. The process began at the extremities and worked inward. Each finger would be broken individually, the small bones crushed with deliberate precision. The screams that resulted were said to be unlike anything human, a sound that witnesses described as coming from some otherworldly realm of suffering. From the fingers, the executioner would move to the hands, then the wrists, working methodically up each arm. Every bone was shattered with calculated strikes, but the victim was kept conscious through careful attention to blood flow and breathing. Medical knowledge was twisted into a tool of torture, ensuring maximum awareness during maximum agony. The breaking of the major bones in the arms and legs required particular skill. Too light a blow would cause pain, but not the complete destruction that was intended. Too heavy, and death might come too quickly. The most experienced executioners could break every major bone in a person's body while keeping them alive for hours. But the true horror of the breaking wheel wasn't just the physical destruction, it was what happened afterward. Once every limb had been systematically destroyed, the victim would be woven through the spokes of the wheel like some grotesque human tapestry. Their broken body would be displayed publicly, sometimes for days, as a warning to others. The most documented case of breaking wheel execution occurred in Munich in 1486. A merchant named Klaus Weber had been convicted of murdering his business partner over a debt dispute. The execution drew crowds from across Bavaria, with people travelling for days to witness the spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe Weber's ordeal in horrifying detail. The breaking process took nearly 3 hours, with deliberate pauses to allow the crowd to absorb the full impact of each shattered bone. Witnesses reported that Weber remained conscious and speaking until his ribs were finally crushed, collapsing his lungs. What made Weber's case particularly notorious wasn't just the brutality of his death, but what happened to his family. His wife and children were forced to watch the entire execution, and his property was confiscated by the state. This combination of physical torture and social destruction was designed to erase not just the individual, but their entire lineage. The psychological impact on medieval society was profound and intentional. These executions weren't just about punishing criminals. They were about creating a population so terrified of authority that rebellion became unthinkable. The message was clear. Challenge the established order, and not only will you die, but you will die in ways that defy human comprehension. Yet even the breaking wheel paled in comparison to the execution method that would become the ultimate symbol of medieval brutality. In the dungeons of the Tower of London, a device was being perfected that would push human suffering to its absolute limits. The rack was deceptively simple in its construction. 2 wooden frames connected by a system of ropes and pulleys that could be operated with methodical precision. But its simplicity masked a diabolical understanding of human anatomy and the limits of physical endurance. These accounts of medieval brutality reveal a dark truth about human nature that extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The calculated cruelty we've explored wasn't the product of primitive minds or backward societies. These were sophisticated systems of control, designed by intelligent people who understood exactly what they were doing. What's perhaps most disturbing is how these methods weren't considered excessive by the standards of their time. They were seen as necessary, even righteous tools for maintaining order and divine justice. The crowds that gathered weren't horrified observers, but active participants in a social ritual that reinforced the absolute power of authority. These executions served their purpose with terrifying effectiveness. They created generations of people who lived in constant fear of stepping out of line, who accepted oppression rather than risk facing such unimaginable suffering. The psychological scars lasted far longer than the physical spectacles themselves. Understanding this history forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, justice, and human capacity for cruelty. It reminds us that the freedoms and protections we take for granted today were built on the graves of those who suffered these medieval horrors. The next time you hear about historical periods being romanticized as simpler times, remember these stories. Remember that behind the castles and chivalry lay a system of justice so brutal that it challenges our very understanding of what humans are capable of inflicting upon each other.